Hello friends, I'm going to start off today's video with a quote from David Graeber. This quote is one of my favorite quotes. "The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently." The reason I love this quote is because it really gets at the heart of sort of my philosophy, especially my political philosophy. I find often that the greatest mental barrier for people who just aren't ready to accept positions like anarchism is that they believe that everything is set in stone and that this is just the way everything had to be. But David Graeber, especially in this book that I'm going to talk about today, really dispels those myths in such a beautiful way. And he shows that we can be different and in very radical ways than you would expect. That leads me to this, The Dawn of Everything. It's a pretty thick book, and it has a lot that it goes over, and in very great detail. This is a sort of David Graeber and David Wengrow, yes, they're both named David, they do acknowledge it. They sort of attempt this very ambitious anthropological overview of the entire human race and dispel a lot of these great myths about sort of social organization and the origins of inequality. One of the key insights that I found from this is that they point out that agriculture did not actually bring about hierarchy in the way that we think about, especially from this like Rousseauian a perspective that before agriculture, everything was sort of in this state of equality, and then we developed agriculture and we settled down, and then we developed cities and hierarchies and all that sort of thing. David Graeber and Wengrow here show that that's just not the case at all. And in fact, with the advent of agriculture, it still took thousands of years in some cases to get to the place when we had hierarchy. And in fact, agriculture was practiced sustainably and while preserving a lot of equality for a very long time in a variety of different societies. Sorry, it's storming outside. I don't know if you can hear all the rain. There's a narrative that that history was just kind of this straight line, and that this just development from sort of a state of nature to civilized society as we know it. But that's just not the case at all. And in fact, there's a lot of societies that practiced a lot of different types of social organization and definitely did not follow a linear path. When he's talking about a lot of the native indigenous people to the Americas, he notes that they were actually more on the path away from civilization. They had these, sort of ancient big empires like the Aztecs and the Incas, right? But before the colonizers from Europe got to the Americas, they were actually headed away from what we would call civilization, sort of the empires of the time, and they were moving more towards this sort of egalitarian type of social living. Then, the Europeans came and things got very complicated, which they go into great detail in this book. And I won't go into detail here, but it's fascinating, at least from that perspective, that they weren't just following this straight path towards monarchy and capitalism. They were going in the complete opposite direction, in fact. Another example that struck out to me is a certain indigenous group. It may have been the Inuit, but I'm not 100% certain on that. But a certain indigenous group that would switch their social organization based on the season, which I know that sounds crazy, but they would literally have more hierarchical organization in the summer, and then in the winter, they would switch to a completely egalitarian type of social organization without any rulers or hierarchy that could be observed. And so they almost established hierarchy sort of as this explicitly temporal thing, a thing that doesn't last past a certain period of time. And so even when they were under those hierarchical systems during a certain season, it wasn't as set in stone. Really what this goes to show is that it's not like you're either one or you're either the other. You're either hierarchical or you're completely egalitarian. David Graeber and Wengrow here show that societies throughout history have always straddled the line and gone back and forth, and in very fascinating ways, and for very different and complex reasons. They sort of point out that hierarchy did not develop from one specific cause, such as the advent of agriculture, but actually from a variety of causes. And I won't go into that in super detail here. I highly suggest reading the book. It is just absolutely fantastic, especially if you're interested in history, anthropology, anarchism, things of that nature. In any case, another takeaway I found from this book that's very, very fascinating to me is that, well, there's sort of this myth that self-governance, sort of a non-hierarchical way of living without rulers or administration, that sort of thing. There's this idea that once you scale that, it becomes impossible. Once you get to a large scale, such as like a city or bigger, it's just impossible to maintain egalitarian types of living. But they also disprove that in this book. They have a lot of examples. The main ones are these large mega sites in Ukraine and also some ancient cities around the Mexico area. What we find from anthropological, sort of archaeological studies of these places is that they had very large populations, and yet they have absolutely no evidence of hierarchical rule. The way that the megasites in Ukraine are set up is they sort of have this circular type of framework where the houses and all the buildings are like in a big circle. And so it sort of creates this dependence on your neighbors, and there's always this giving where your neighbors to your left might take care of you, and you take care of your neighbors to your right. So it's this very complex system of mutual aid that was practiced a very, very long time ago. I mean, even I, as an anarchist, have sometimes questioned how will all of this scale at a larger level. And really, the whole point of this book and the point of the quote that I said at the beginning of the video is that we can organize ourselves in such radical and interesting ways. And there are probably so many ways that we could organize ourselves that have never been done before, or that were done before, but that we have not discovered yet. And so there's so many possibilities, and to just say, no, that's impossible, is just ignorant of the fact that we have proven that mutual aid and non-hierarchical structures can be sustainable and beneficial and can maintain themselves. This has been proven throughout history, and they go into a lot of detail in this book about that. So there's really a lot of possibilities on the horizon for humanity, and it just gives me a lot of hope. And ultimately, I just hate the idea that history is this sort of teleology, that we had to go on this linear path and we have to get to this specific point, or that we are there, sort of this Hegelian concept that history has ended and we've reached the plateau. I mean, I think even a lot of Marxists and, adjacent sort of ideologies fall into this trap that things are just destined to happen in a certain way, and they sort of forget that we made all of this stuff up. We are just animals, and the state and capitalism and money and borders and all of that stuff, we made it up. And we could just as easily choose to live in a completely different way. And the type of experimentation that you see in early human societies is proof of that. It's proof that we were never boxed in. We just happen to feel like we're boxed in now because the whole world looks like capitalism generally. And so we feel like that's it. Like, this is how it was all supposed to be. So that's really the message I want to leave you on. I highly suggest, if you want to know more, that you should read this. Again, it is pretty long, but it's very accessible, surprisingly, and it goes into a lot of great detail, and it's really entertaining. I could not put this book down. It flowed really super well. The chapters are broken up very well, so it's easy to pick up and put down. So anyways, highly suggest you read this, and that's really all I have to say for this video. So I'll see you in the next one.